It is twice as terrible when juveniles are convicted of horrible crimes. It speaks of how much society has failed when those we should call innocent end up behind bars. This video will examine the 20 longest sentences given to actual teenagers, concentrating on the distinct narratives of those involved and the intricate circumstances surrounding their cases. Let's begin the countdown. 1. Cyntoia Brown. Cyntoia Brown, 16, had a difficult past and encountered numerous problems in her life. These circumstances eventually led to her being sentenced to life in prison. She was born in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, but Eleanor Brown adopted her at a young age. Cyntoia's life was plagued with adversity, beginning with a rough childhood and culminating with her becoming a victim of sex trafficking. In August 2004, a young woman found herself in a difficult situation that would significantly impact the rest of her life. According to reports, she shot and killed a 43-year-old man named Johnny Allen, whom she had met for a sexual encounter. In her statement, she claimed that she believed Allen was reaching for a weapon and that she acted in self-defense. However, the prosecution argued that the woman who engaged in sex work had murdered Allen to steal from him. As a result of this, she received a life sentence in prison. This sparked debates around the treatment of juvenile defendants and victims of sex trafficking within the legal system. Her case later gained increased attention and support from celebrities like Rihanna and Kim Kardashian West, who advocated on her behalf. In 2017, after serving approximately 15 years in prison, she was granted a pardon by the governor of Tennessee. Since being released, she has furthered her education and uses her experiences to promote reforms around victim support services and criminal justice processes. 2. Quantel Lotz. Quantel Lotz was just 14 years old when he was given life imprisonment. Lotz spent his childhood in St. Louis, Missouri. Tragically, he was given a sentence that most people would find difficult to comprehend: life in prison without the chance of parole. Lotz had a difficult upbringing that was marked by abuse and neglect. He usually found himself in violent circumstances, which would mold his future in ways that would be catastrophic. In 1999, a tragic incident occurred when Lotz and his stepbrother Michael Burton were engaged in a heated debate that quickly escalated into a fatal confrontation. Burton's life came to a sad end when Lotz stabbed him. Their relationship was already violent, but the event made it more frightening. The harsh neighborhood they grew up in affected how they acted. Lotz was not an adult yet when he committed the crime. However, he got the same punishment as an adult. His sentencing of life in prison without the possibility of release was shocking, setting a dark precedent as one of the heaviest penalties ever handed down to a juvenile. This was because the crime was so severe. Later, he appealed his case with the assistance of his attorney in light of developing laws and with a better knowledge of the psychological needs of juveniles. The United States decided it was unlawful to sentence minors to mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, which was a significant factor in the appeal of Lotz's case. In 2017, he got a new sentence, which means he can now be considered for parole after spending almost 20 years in prison. Even though they committed very serious crimes, the experiences of these young people remind us how important it is to deal with systemic problems in a careful way and support their efforts to change and improve. 3. Christy Cherami. At 16, Christy Cherami's life took a turn for the worse. She was accused of killing her great-aunt and later condemned to life in prison without the possibility of release. Christy's story exemplifies how youthful naivety can lead to devastating consequences. In 1994, Christy got engaged to her longtime lover, Claude, who was then 20. Claude had hatched a plot to eliminate his great-aunt, whose ranch he intended to take over after she passed away. Christy wasn't involved in the actual stabbing or shooting, but she was there at the time, and she even helped write a forged letter to cover up the crime. But they found the letter, and that made them arrest Christy and find out about the murder plan. At the time of Christy's trial, her attorney suggested that she plead guilty to second-degree murder in the hope that she would receive a more compassionate sentence due to her age and the fact that she was not directly involved in the murder. But it did not turn out as planned. Christy was given a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of release as a result of the plan, which ultimately failed. In 2010, her case received attention from various human rights organizations over the court, which resulted in a retrial. Her sentence was not reduced, even though she was a minor at the time of the crime, and that she played a role as an accomplice. Despite her circumstances, Christie made it a priority to further her education. She not only earned her GED, but also began instructing other inmates. In November 2020, her life sentence was reduced to 40 years, which offered a ray of hope for a life outside of jail. 4. Milton Letarians. Grand theft auto and assault are serious crimes, but they are even more shocking when committed by a 7-year-old. That is what happened with Letarian Milton, a Florida native who became infamous for his juvenile delinquency. The severity of his criminal behavior and the number of times he was in trouble with the authorities increased as he grew older. In 2008, Milton first came to the notice of the people when he stole his grandmother's SUV and went for a joyride, resulting in several mishaps. When local news reporters approached him about his acts, he displayed a stunning lack of remorse and stated that he did it because he thought it would be enjoyable to do horrible things and was arrested for his actions. Unfortunately, as Milton got older, his behavior became much more problematic. His criminal behavior started early and got worse over time. At the age of 16, he took part in an armed robbery that landed him in jail for a long time. He had already had many run-ins with the law before that, showing a growing tendency to break the law. Letarian Milton's story is thought-provoking because it raises questions about how to deal with criminals who start young. His case has also sparked debates about the role of media attention, early intervention, and social neglect in such situations. 5. Antonio Nunez Jr. When he was only 16 years old, Antonio Nunez Jr. became involved in a horrific crime that changed his life forever. On the last day of 2010 in South Texas, he and 2 other men kidnapped a young couple, Jose Avila and his 15-year-old girlfriend. They took them to an isolated place where they shot and killed Avila. The girl was let go without any physical harm, but the terrible ordeal left her scarred for life. Nunez faced trial as an adult and was found guilty of murder. He got a life sentence, becoming one of the youngest people in the U.S. to suffer such a severe penalty. His lawyers claimed that he was just a pawn under the influence of the older men and that he should not be held equally responsible. But their argument was ignored, and Nunez was doomed to spend his life behind bars. His case raises difficult issues about the justice of treating minors as adults and the consequences it has for their future. 6. Jordan Brown. In 2009, Jordan Brown, a native of Pennsylvania, made history when he became one of the youngest people in the annals of United States criminal prosecution charged with homicide at 11 years old. At 11 years old, Brown was accused of killing his father's pregnant fiancée, Kenzie Hawk, and their unborn child. At the time, Brown's father was engaged to Kenzie Hawk. In court, the prosecution stated that Brown committed the crime because he was envious that he could get a new brother or sister soon. Consequently, Brown was charged as an adult, which sparked a legal struggle and a backlash from the general public. Given his age, many people believed that the court's decision was excessive. The subsequent legal battle lasted for 3 years, ultimately resulting in his conviction and the imposition of a sentence in a juvenile detention institution before age 21. Brown's lawyers did not give up on challenging the verdict. They said that important evidence was ignored and that the probe was faulty. In 2018, after a long legal battle, the Pennsylvania Superior Court reversed Brown's conviction, saying there was no physical proof. This was a key moment in the discussion about how young offenders should be treated, especially at the right age for a minor to face trial as an adult. 7. Lionel Tate. Lionel Tate received a life sentence without parole in 2001, becoming the youngest American to face such a fate. He was 12 years old when he was found guilty of killing Tiffany Unick, a 6-year-old girl who was under the care of his mother. The murder happened in 1999 in Broward County, Florida, while Tate and Tiffany were alone in front of the TV. Tate said they were playing wrestling like they saw on the screen, but Tiffany's injuries were too severe to match his story. She died from the brutal damage he inflicted on her. The trial of Lionel Tate stirred up a lot of controversy. He was an adult in the eyes of the law when he faced the charge of first-degree murder. He got a life sentence without parole after he was convicted. Many people argued about the morality of treating a child like an adult and locking them up for life. His harsh punishment also drew criticism from the international community and human rights groups who wanted a more humane way to deal with his case, considering his young age. In 2004, his sentence was reversed by an appeals court because he never had a mental competency test before or during his trial, He agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder, which changed his life sentence to 1 year of house arrest and 10 years of probation. Unfortunately, Tate's life did not get better after he got out. He kept going back to prison for breaking his probation rules and facing new criminal charges, raising doubts about how well the justice system can help people change. 8. Jacob Ind. Jacob Ind, a 15-year-old from Colorado, was found guilty of killing his mother and stepfather, Pamela and Kermode Jordan, in 1992. The case revealed a shocking story of alleged abuse that lasted for years and ended with a bloody act of violence. According to court testimony, Jacob and his older brother Charles suffered from emotional, physical, and sexual abuse by their parents. They felt hopeless and angry as the system failed to protect them. Jacob came up with a plan to murder his abusers. He and his friend Gabriel Adams carried out the terrible plan in December 1992, which resulted in the death of Jacob's mother and stepfather. To carry out the killings, the adolescents used a variety of weapons, including knives, a baseball bat, and a rifle. Jacob maintained throughout his trial that he committed the killings out of desperation, as they were his only remaining option for evading the terrible environment he was subjected to at home. However, despite his numerous appeals, he was still sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. His situation attracted much attention and compassion, and he claimed that it demonstrated the critical need for institutional reforms to safeguard children from abuse. In 2019, after more than 20 years had passed, Jacob was resentenced and offered the option of parole after 40 years. This reflects the shifting standards in the sentencing of adolescents, which have been in place for the past few decades. 9. Dominic Culpepper. Dominic Culpepper, also known as Dominic Culpepper from Wisconsin, found himself on the wrong side of the law after being involved in a shooting that resulted in the death of another person. At 16, he was accused of participating in a botched robbery that led to the death of a store employee. This event kicked off a court struggle that would label him a youthful offender with one of the most extended punishments. However, the court proceeding involving a juvenile offender sparked a discussion on how the legal system deals with adolescents who are engaged in significant criminal activity. Some people believe that it is unfair to sentence a juvenile to such a lengthy prison term, since it does not take into account the individual's capacity for personal development and rehabilitation. On the other side, supporters of the sentence contend that the gravity of the offense justifies the duration of the punishment. They say this to defend the sentence. 10. Paul Gingerich. In 2010, Paul Gingerich's case rocked the country. At 12, he became one of the youngest children in the history of Indiana to be sentenced as an adult. This event sent shockwaves throughout the country. Colt Lundy, who was only 15 years old, Athen, and Gingerich were both suspected of being involved in the killing of Lundy's stepfather, Philip Danner. According to the materials filed in the case, the two young boys concealed the conspiracy to murder to alleviate Lundy's anxiety towards his stepfather. They were under the impression that Danner would act violently toward Lundy if he found out about their intention to flee to Arizona, and they told him. After shooting Danner at his home, the lad stole his car and fled to the state, only to be captured a short time later in Illinois. Because of the gravity of the offense, Gingerich was sent to the adult court system, where he entered a guilty plea to the charge of conspiring to commit murder. He was one of the youngest children ever to be tried as an adult, and he was given 30 years in prison due to his crime. In Gingerich's case, significant changes have been made to the law in Indiana over several years, most notably in the areas of punishment of juveniles and transfer to adult court. In 2015, his conviction was eventually overturned due to legislative amendments, and he was sentenced to 25 years to some portion to be served in a group home or on probation. 11. George Stinney. The case of George Stinney, a black adolescent from South Carolina, is one of the most notorious in the history of American justice. Stinney was a victim of one of the most notorious crimes in American history. In 1944, while Stinney was just 14 years old, he was wrongfully accused of the murder of two white girls, Betty June Binnicker, who was 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, who was 8. Both of these girls were killed. The racial injustice represented by his trial and subsequent execution will never be forgotten. The girls' bodies were discovered in a ditch, having died from a strike to the head. Later, Stinney was caught, and taken into custody by local law enforcement under duress, even though no rugged proof connected him to the crime. After some weeks, he confessed. In 2014, a judge in South Carolina decided that Stinney had not been given a fair trial, which led to the posthumous overturning of his conviction for the crime for which he had been tried. Even though this verdict came around 70 years later, which was too late for Stinney, it functioned as a type of belated justice and a historical acknowledgement of a serious breach of the law. 12. Mason Summers. It's a heartbreaking reminder that one act of violence can drastically change the course of a young person's life. In 2011, Summers was convicted for a fatal shooting during a failed robbery in Phoenix, Arizona. At the time of his conviction, Summers was only 16 years old. A convenience shop was the target of Summers's and a few other older accomplices' efforts to commit a robbery. During the theft, Summers shot and killed the store's proprietor. After that, he was taken into custody and charged with murder in the first degree and armed robbery. Even though Summers was still a minor at the time of his trial, he was treated as an adult by the judge, a judgment that has frequently aroused debate about the moral and ethical consequences of treating minors as adults in a court of law. The punishment of life in prison without the possibility of parole was handed down after his trial. The situation involving Mason Summers brings to light the ongoing discussion of whether or not heavy punishments should be given to juvenile offenders. Critics contend that such severe penalties do not consider the cognitive growth of adolescents or their ability for reform, and that this undermines the effectiveness of the policies. Despite these considerations, others believe that Summers' offenses were severe enough to warrant a life sentence. 13. Andrew Golden. Andrew Golden's case is possibly one of the most horrific in recent American history. In 1988, at Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas, Golden and another student named Mitchell Johnson carried out a murder that had been methodically planned. The two individuals, ages 11 and 13 respectively, enacted a fire drill to coax their classmates and teachers away from the building. Golden and Johnson opened fire from a nearby forested area once the school had been evacuated, resulting in the deaths of 4 children and a teacher and the injury of 10 others. In 2007, at 21 years, he was released, but legal problems plagued his life. However, at the age of 33, he passed away as a result of an automobile accident. His case serves as a disturbing reminder of the potential for tremendous violence among even the youngest members of society, as well as the difficulties that can arise when attempting to deal with such situations inside the legal system. 14. Nathaniel Abraham. In 1997, Nathaniel Abraham, one of the youngest charged murderers in the United States, was born in Michigan and was found guilty of the crime. He was arrested for his alleged involvement in a gunshot that took the life of Ronnie Green Jr., who was 18 years old, while Abraham was just 11 years old. Abraham, who was claimed to have the mental capacity of a child between the ages of 6 and 8 years old, was tried as an adult, which resulted in an outcry from civil rights organizations as well as advocates for juvenile justice. The circumstances surrounding his case sparked an ongoing discussion regarding the moral and ethical ramifications of prosecuting adolescents as adults. The story of Abraham does not have a happy ending. Even though he showed early signs of turning his life around after being released from prison, he eventually found himself on the wrong side of the law and faced various counts in separate situations. 15. Robert Thompson and John Venables. In 1993, the United Kingdom was shaken by a horrific and sad crime when a 2-year-old kid named James Bolger was murdered by 2 10-year-old boys named Robert Thompson and John Venables. The case was terrible not only because of the violent nature of the crime, but also due to the tender age of the culprits, which made it one of the most high-profile cases in the history of criminal activity in the United Kingdom. At a shopping center at Bootle, Liverpool, Thompson's Invincibles successfully diverted Bolger's attention away from his mother. The child's body, which had been severely beaten, was discovered on a railroad track 2 days later. Moreover, the age of the perpetrators, combined with the heinous nature of the crime, provoked outrage and horror across the country. Both boys were accused of murder and found guilty of the charge, making them the youngest people in modern English history to be convicted of murder. They were given a sentence of incarceration until they reached the age of adulthood, at which point the United Kingdom's parole board would decide whether or not to release them. In 2001, both Thompson and Venables were granted lifelong licenses. For their safety, they were provided with new identities and released from custody because of the public nature of their crime. 16. Cruel Konya. Cruel Konya's story is a striking reminder of how a split-second decision may have life-altering repercussions. Konya, a resident of Newark, New Jersey. At age 15, he was involved in a fatal shooting that resulted in his conviction for murder. In 2012, Konya and a few other people who were working with him made an effort to rob a local business person. The attempted robbery resulted in a fatal gunshot, which led to Konya's later arrest and trial for the crime. He was tried as an adult, even though he was still a minor, which is a regular but controversial method in the American legal system when dealing with significant offenses committed by juveniles. However, his trial resulted in a sentence that he would spend the rest of his life in prison without eligibility for parole. Since then, the circumstances surrounding Konya's case have been discussed over the severity of punishments for juvenile criminals, the likelihood of their rehabilitation, and the implications for society that come with imprisoning kids for life. 17. Curtis Jones. The case of Curtis Jones is a heartbreaking account of abuse and the consequences of that abuse. Jones and his sister Catherine Jones, who was 13 then, became the youngest children in the United States when they were 12. They were tried as adults and charged with murder in the first degree. These siblings settled in Brevard County, Florida, where they shared a home with their biological father and stepmother. However, both of the kids were abused to a very terrible degree. It is alleged that Curtis was subjected to sexual abuse by a male relative who also resided in the same house. After the adults refused to respond to the children's cries for assistance, the children ultimately decided to take matters into their own hands. In 1999, they conceived a scheme to eliminate their father, stepmother, and another male relative, and they ultimately succeeded in murdering Sonia Nicole Spites, their father's girlfriend. The children, realizing the gravity of their conduct, ran away but were quickly apprehended by authorities. After a few years, they were tried as adults, and each received a sentence of 18 years in prison, after which they were placed on probation for the rest of their lives. In 2015, at 29, Curtis Jones was granted freedom. His narrative sheds attention on the complicated problems surrounding child abuse, the responses of social services, and the urgent need for sentencing reform for juvenile offenders. 18. Mitchell Johnson. Mitchell and his fellow student, Andrew Golden, were responsible for a terrible act of violence witnessed nationwide and sent shockwaves throughout the country. Johnson was involved in a shooting that was painstakingly planned and carried out at the West Side Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas when he was just 13 years old. In 1998, the young boys deceived their fellow students and the teachers at their school by simulating a fire alarm and drawing them outside. So when individuals began to pour out of the school, Johnson and Golden, hiding in the woods nearby, began firing their weapons. The dreadful incident was responsible for the deaths of 5 people, 4 of whom were students, and 1 of whom was a teacher. Not only did the event trigger talks about school safety and gun control, but it also sparked conversations about how the justice system deals with juvenile offenders guilty of major crimes. Johnson's life following his release paints a bleak picture of the difficulties that are there in the process of reintegrating individuals with his background into society. 19. Cameron Coker. In 1989, Cameron Coker, who was 9 years old, was from Pennsylvania. Coker shot and killed a 7-year-old named Jessica Carr, his next-door neighbor. The tragedy of Cameron Coker serves as a sobering reminder of the potentially terrible repercussions that can result from child's play. The senselessness of the event, combined with the young ages of those who were engaged, made it an extremely startling occurrence. On the day of the incident, Coker allegedly went into his living room and took a hunting rifle that belonged to his father after getting furious about losing a video game to Jessica. He shot toward Jessica, who was operating a snowmobile in her backyard. The bullet hit Jessica, and she couldn't survive her sustained wounds. Later, he was charged as an adult with criminal homicide after he was tried as a juvenile. The court hearings sparked discussion on a national level about how the justice system deals with juvenile criminals and attracted national attention. In the end, Coker was found guilty of manslaughter through no fault of his own and was ordered to serve his time in a private residential community until he became 21 years old. Since his release, Coker has avoided getting into any legal difficulties. Despite this, his case made an indelible mark on the nation's collective psyche about the treatment and punishment meted out to offenders. 20. Derek and Alex King. In 2021, a horrifying crime was committed by two young brothers, Derek and Alex King, who were aged 13 and 12 years respectively. This act shocked the United States. The jury decided that the children were responsible for the death of their father, Terry King, which occurred in their home in Florida, and declared them guilty. Their case took an unexpected turn when a family acquaintance named Ricky Chavis, who had previously served time for sexually abusing children, was accused of the crime. The lads asserted that they had murdered their father to protect themselves and their siblings from his violent treatment and intended to live in caves in the future. The story of these brothers is an instructive illustration of how youngsters can be led astray by adults, which brings to light the problem of juveniles being tried and sentenced as adults for significant offenses. This instance, along with others like it, demonstrates how crucial it is to have effective intervention and prevention programs to prevent juvenile delinquency.